Centuries ago, ships left African shores carrying men, women, and children who had no choice about where they were going. Families were separated, names were changed, languages faded across generations. For millions of their descendants, Africa became something both familiar and distant, a homeland remembered through history, but often impossible to locate on a family map. Now imagine history moving in the opposite direction. On the 20th of April 2026 in Ouagadougou, Burkina Faso, about 20 Afro-descendants connected with the African Diaspora Development Institute received permanent resident cards from Burkinabe authorities. They were not receiving citizenship. That distinction matters. Permanent residence does not automatically make someone a Burkinabe citizen. Yet a small administrative card can carry meaning far beyond its physical size. For these descendants of Africa, it represented something their ancestors could never have imagined. This journey was not forced. They were choosing Africa for themselves. And that raises a powerful question. What happens when an African nation stops telling the diaspora simply to visit, reconnect with history, spend money, and then fly away? What happens when it begins offering something deeper? Come live here, build here, invest here, become part of the community. Under Captain Ibrahim Traore, Burkina Faso is testing that possibility. But emotion alone cannot tell us whether this experiment will succeed. We must examine what permanent residence actually means, what the diaspora could bring back in capital, knowledge, technology, and experience, and whether Burkina Faso can transform a symbolic homecoming into lasting development. We must also examine Traore's role and the serious criticism surrounding his government. If you value stories about Africa that examine both hope and evidence, follow this channel as we continue watching these changes together. Because this story is bigger than one card, one organization, or one president. For centuries, the most painful image was the ship carrying Africans away. Today, Burkina Faso offers a different image, one carrying enormous historical weight. Descendants crossing the Atlantic by choice, arriving not merely to remember the past, but asking whether Africa can once again become a place they can truly call home again, by choice today. To understand why that return carries such emotional weight, we have to look backward before looking forward. The forced removal of Africans across the Atlantic did more than move people from one continent to another. It separated families, disrupted communities, and created generations whose connection to Africa survived even when the exact details of ancestry became difficult to recover. For many descendants in the United States, the Caribbean, and elsewhere in the Americas, that history can create a complicated question of identity. A person may know where he was born, where his parents lived, and where his grandparents are buried, yet still wonder what came before America. Imagine reaching 65 or 70 years old after building a career, raising children, and becoming a grandfather, while one question remains unanswered. Where did my family begin before this country became our home? That is why returning to Africa can mean more than taking a vacation. But we must be careful with the history. We cannot assume that the ancestors of the Afro-descendants receiving permanent residence in Burkina Faso were taken specifically from the territory that is Burkina Faso today. The African diaspora emerged through complicated movements involving many regions, peoples, and generations. For some descendants, identifying one exact ancestral community may be impossible. So Burkina Faso is not necessarily returning these individuals to the precise village their ancestors left. What it is offering is different. It is giving some descendants an opportunity to establish a new legal relationship with the continent their ancestors were separated from. That distinction makes the story stronger, not weaker. History cannot be reversed. No government can return lost generations, restore every forgotten name, or reconstruct every broken family line. But governments can decide what happens next. They can treat descendants only as tourists who arrive, spend money, visit historical sites, and leave. Or they can begin building pathways that allow some of them to remain. And that is where the story changes from memory to policy. Because returning emotionally to Africa is one thing. Having a recognized legal right to stay is something entirely different for generations. That legal right brings us to the small card at the center of this story. On the 20th of April 2026, Burkinabe authorities presented permanent resident cards to about 20 Afro-descendants associated with the African Diaspora Development Institute. It is important to understand exactly what happened. These recipients did not become citizens of Burkina Faso that day. Think of the process as three separate doors. The first door is entry. A visitor receives permission to enter the country under the applicable immigration rules. The second door is residence. Permanent resident status gives an approved person a legal basis to remain in Burkina Faso long term. The third door is citizenship. That is a separate legal status with its own requirements and procedures. Confusing those three doors can turn an important story into an exaggerated one. The Permanent Residence Initiative also did not appear from nowhere. In October 2025, Burkina Faso adopted a regulatory framework setting conditions and procedures for permanent resident cards for Afro-descendants. That means the April ceremony rested on an administrative process involving more than a presidential speech. The Ministry of Foreign Affairs, identification authorities, diplomatic officials, the African Diaspora Development Institute, and applicants all had roles in the process. That institutional detail matters. A charismatic leader can announce an idea. A government ceremony can give it visibility. But if people are going to move their savings, businesses, and families across an ocean, they need more than inspiring words. They need rules they can understand and documents recognized by government. This is why one message surrounding the ceremony carried such emotional power. The recipients were told, in essence, that they were no longer merely visitors, but part of the larger Burkinabe family. For someone whose ancestors were separated from Africa generations ago, those words can be profound. Still, belonging cannot be created by a card alone. The real test begins afterward. Can a new resident build a home, understand the culture, establish a business, contribute to the community, and develop relationships strong enough that Burkina Faso becomes more than a destination? That is where legal residence must become everyday integration. A permanent residence card, however, is only the beginning. The deeper question is whether a person who returns can actually build a life. There is a major difference between heritage tourism, homecoming, and integration. Heritage tourism may mean spending 2 weeks in Africa, visiting historic places, tasting local food, meeting families, and experiencing the powerful emotion of standing on African soil. For someone whose ancestors were removed generations ago, none of that should be dismissed. The experience can be deeply personal, but eventually the visitor boards a plane and returns to Atlanta, New York, London, or another home abroad. Integration asks for something more. It begins when someone stays long enough to deal with ordinary life. Where will I live? How do I open a bank account? What laws govern property? Can I establish a business? What taxes will I owe? How do I understand local customs? How do I become a good neighbor rather than simply a welcomed guest? That is where the African Diaspora Development Institute becomes important in this story. The organization has worked to connect members of the African diaspora with Burkina Faso, and large groups of Afro-descendants visited the country before the permanent residence ceremony in 2026. Those visits helped create visibility and relationships. Yet the real measure of success will not be how many people arrive for ceremonies. It will be how many build durable connections afterward. A successful homecoming must work in both directions. Burkina Faso can offer legal residence, cultural connection, and opportunities to participate in the country's future. New residents, in turn, must learn how their experience and resources can serve communities already living there. That changes the central question. Instead of asking only what Africa can give descendants returning from abroad, we should also ask what those descendants can responsibly bring back. And the answer is much larger than money. Across the diaspora are decades of professional experience, business knowledge, technical skills, international relationships, and accumulated capital. If those resources can cross the Atlantic with the people who possess them, homecoming begins to become lasting development for those local communities. That brings us to one reason African governments are paying closer attention to the diaspora. The African Union estimates that nearly 160 million people of African descent live outside the continent. In 2024, remittances flowing into Africa exceeded $100 billion. That number needs context. Remittances are not the same as investment capital. Much of that money helps families pay for food, housing, education, medical care, and daily expenses. That's $100 billion is not simply waiting to fund factories and businesses. The opportunity extends beyond money. Think of four forms of capital. First is financial capital. Some returning residents may have savings, businesses, or access to investors who could support productive projects. Second is professional skill. Imagine a 67-year-old engineer in Texas with 40 years of experience. He may never invest millions of dollars in Burkina Faso, but he could help train technicians and pass practical knowledge to a younger generation. Third is technology and practical knowledge itself. Doctors, farmers, bankers, information technology specialists, and manufacturers living abroad may understand systems and methods that can be adapted locally. Fourth is networks. A diaspora entrepreneur may know suppliers, customers, universities, investors, and professionals abroad. Those relationships can sometimes open doors that money alone cannot. This is why one idea deserves attention. The diaspora is not merely a wallet. Its greatest contribution may sometimes be knowledge. If African countries see their descendants abroad only as people who should send money home, they overlook much of their value. The greater opportunity is to create what some development discussions call brain circulation. A physician in Chicago does not necessarily have to abandon the United States permanently to contribute. She might spend part of each year training medical workers, advising a clinic, connecting equipment suppliers, or supporting younger professionals. That makes Burkina Faso's experiment more interesting. The question is not simply how much money returning descendants might bring. It is whether residents can create enough trust and stability for their experience, knowledge, relationships, and capital to become useful inside the country. And in 2026, Burkina Faso began connecting that idea to specific development projects. The next development came almost immediately. On the 20th of April 2026, permanent resident cards symbolize belonging. One day later, the conversation shifted toward development. Burkina Faso, through its national office responsible for major projects, signed a memorandum of understanding with the African Diaspora Development Institute. The agreement identified areas where cooperation could move beyond ceremonies and toward practical economic activity. Those areas included microfinance, vocational training, healthcare, information and communications technology, and agriculture. Other initiatives discussed around the agreement included a Pan-African television project, support for vocational training in Ziniare, and the ambitious concept known as Wakanda City. The timing matters. If April 20 represented the right to remain, April 21 raised the question of what returning members of the diaspora might actually build. But this is also where enthusiasm needs discipline. A memorandum of understanding is not a completed factory, operating bank, functioning city, or successful business. It expresses intentions and creates a framework for cooperation. It does not prove that financing has been secured or that promised economic benefits have already reached ordinary Burkinabe families. That distinction will become increasingly important. In several years, the meaningful questions will not concern applause at signing ceremonies. They will concern results. How many businesses became operational? How many Burkinabe workers found employment? How many young people received useful vocational training? How much private capital was actually invested? How many projects survived beyond the announcement? And perhaps most importantly, did local communities experience measurable benefits? Those questions should not be viewed as hostility toward the initiative. They are the standards that can separate a powerful symbol from a durable development model. If diaspora investors bring money but create little opportunity for local citizens, the promise will remain incomplete. If they bring expertise, train workers, establish sustainable businesses, and build partnerships with Burkinabe communities, the story becomes considerably more significant for ordinary families. This is where President Ibrahim Traore enters the next part of our story. For supporters, he is not simply the leader who opened the door to diaspora residents. He has become the political symbol behind a much larger Pan-African idea. For supporters, that larger idea begins with sovereignty. Ibrahim Traore has become one of the most recognizable figures in today's Pan-African conversation. His appeal, especially among some younger Africans and members of the diaspora, is tied to a message that Africa should depend less on outside powers and build more of its capacity at home. His government has connected that message to African mobility and diaspora engagement. In 2024, when Traore met representatives of the African Diaspora Development Institute, he encouraged the diaspora to help strengthen African unity, reconnect people with their history, and present a different image of Burkina Faso to the world. His message treated the diaspora as more than potential investors. They could become connectors between Africa and communities abroad. That philosophy appears elsewhere in his policies. In 2025, Burkina Faso adopted a measure making visas free for citizens of African countries. Free visas are not permanent residence and neither should be confused with citizenship. But the measure fits a broader argument that Africans should face fewer barriers when moving across their own continent. Traore has also emphasized building skills inside Africa. Rather than depending indefinitely on sending people abroad for training, he has argued for bringing expertise and trainers into African countries so local capacity can grow. For diaspora policy, that idea matters. A returning engineer, physician, entrepreneur, or technician can become part of that transfer of knowledge. This helps explain why Traore has become such a powerful symbol for some Pan-African supporters. His youth, language of sovereignty, emphasis on dignity and self-reliance, and association with the revolutionary legacy of Thomas Sankara have given Burkina Faso attention far beyond its borders. But we should resist turning this into the story of one man saving Africa. Traore can act as a catalyst. He can open political doors. He can inspire people to look toward Burkina Faso. He cannot make every project work. Ministries, laws, courts, businesses, administrators, local communities, and the diaspora itself must carry the idea forward. A leader can open a door. Only strong institutions can keep that door open after the leader is gone. And the idea behind that door did not begin in Burkina Faso. For years, the African Union has formally recognized the African diaspora as part of the continent's larger family. It has even described the diaspora as Africa's sixth region, alongside the 5 geographic regions of North, South, East, West, and Central Africa. That matters because it changes how we understand Burkina Faso's experiments. Traore's government did not invent the idea that descendants living outside Africa should participate in Africa's future. What Burkina Faso is attempting is to move part of that Pan-African vision from declarations into practical national policy. Residence is one example. Easier African mobility is another. Investment, skills transfer, business formation, and long-term integration could become others. This is the difference between Pan-Africanism based mainly on emotion and Pan-Africanism supported by institutions. For generations, people have spoken about African unity, but unity becomes more meaningful when ordinary people can ask practical questions. Can Africans travel more easily across African borders? Can members of the diaspora establish legal residence? Can entrepreneurs invest across countries without impossible barriers? Can professional skills earned abroad be used effectively at home? Can capital move toward productive African businesses? Those questions are less dramatic than revolutionary speeches, but their answers may determine whether Pan-Africanism changes everyday life. Supporters sometimes speak of one African passport, one currency, or even deeper political integration. Those remain broad Pan-African aspirations, not accomplishments created by Burkina Faso's permanent residence program. 20 resident cards cannot erase the continent's borders, but they can demonstrate what a smaller institutional step looks like. That is why Burkina Faso deserves attention without being turned into a fantasy. Its significance may lie not in having already achieved African unity, but in testing one practical way of making belonging easier for people whose connection to Africa survived outside its borders. And every experiment must eventually face difficult questions, because opening Africa to descendants abroad is only one measure of progress. The strength of a Pan-African project must also be judged by how governments treat the people already living inside their borders today, tomorrow, and beyond. That brings us to the difficult side of this story. While Burkina Faso is opening a door to Afro-descendants, the government of Ibrahim Traore has also faced serious criticism from international human rights organizations and foreign observers. Concerns have included restrictions on press freedom, pressure on journalists and critics, limits on civic space, and allegations of human rights abuses during the country's continuing security crisis. These concerns should not simply be dismissed because some criticism comes from Western institutions. At the same time, we should be equally careful with another popular claim. There is not sufficient evidence to say that France, the United States, or the West broadly opposes Burkina Faso specifically because it is given permanent residence to members of the African diaspora. Burkina Faso's deteriorating relationship with France and several Western partners involves a much larger struggle over security partnerships, military rule, foreign influence, sovereignty, regional alliances, and competing geopolitical interests. That context matters. Supporters of Traore see a young African leader demanding dignity, greater control over national resources, and freedom from relationships they believe preserve patterns inherited from colonialism. Critics see military rule, concentrated political power, restrictions on independent voices, and serious questions about accountability. Both sets of concerns deserve examination. Africa's colonial history makes skepticism toward foreign pressure understandable. France's long political and military role in West Africa has left deep mistrust among many Africans. But history cannot become an excuse to ignore every criticism made against an African government. Likewise, the language of human rights should never become a convenient cover for outside powers pursuing their own strategic interests. The standard should remain consistent. If Burkina Faso wants returning descendants to invest their savings, relocate their families, establish companies, and build their futures there, permanent residence is only one part of the promise. They will also need predictable laws, personal security, reliable institutions, and confidence that their rights will endure. A country can tell the diaspora, come home. The harder task is building a society where they and the Burkinabe people themselves will still want to call it home decades later, for generations to come. The lesson for Africa is not that every country should copy Burkina Faso tomorrow. The lesson is that homecoming needs a structure. First, do not stop at heritage tourism. Build a clear path from visiting to legal residence to responsible investment and finally to genuine integration. Second, residents must rest on law rather than personal favor. Leaders change. Institutions must survive them. Third, African governments should stop seeing the diaspora only as a source of money. Ask not only what people can invest, but what they can build, teach, and transfer. Fourth, local citizens must benefit. Returning entrepreneurs should create jobs, train workers, pay taxes, respect local culture, and build partnerships, rather than becoming a privileged class above the people already there. And finally, Pan-Africanism cannot depend on one leader. That is why the story of Ibrahim Traore and Burkina Faso matters, but it must be judged over time. The same applies to the wider political experiment involving Assimi Goïta in Mali and Abdourahmane Chiani in Niger across the Sahel and West Africa. Their challenge is larger than rejecting France or criticizing old relationships. It is proving that sovereignty can produce stronger institutions and better opportunities for ordinary Africans. The African Union has spoken for years about connecting Africa with its diaspora. Now, policies like permanent residence give that idea a practical test. Centuries ago, ships carried Africans away without their consent. Today, descendants can cross the Atlantic by choice. That choice is powerful, but it is only the beginning. Africa cannot rewrite the ships that carried its people away, but Africa can decide what kind of doors it opens when their descendants return. And after opening those doors, it must give them reasons to stay, contribute, and belong. If you follow African news and the changing story of the continent, subscribe and continue this journey with us. And tell us below, if an African country offered you a pathway to permanent residence, would you consider returning? Burkina Faso has opened the question. The answer will depend on what is built after the ceremonies end. History will decide what comes next. We sincerely appreciate your time and support. Every video on this channel is carefully researched, thoughtfully written, and meticulously edited by our dedicated team. We don't rely on automated production or shortcuts to create our content. Every story, every visual, and every detail is crafted with genuine care, passion, and a commitment to bringing you meaningful, high-quality videos.